Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for Visionary Leadership, Managing the Present with an Eye on the Future. I am James C. Horton, Director of Learning and Leadership Development here at the National Guild for Community Arts Education, and I am proud to be joined today by John McCann, President of Partners in Performance, and the Chief Architect and Lead Facilitator for the National Guild's Community Arts Education Leadership Institute, Kaylee. Without further ado, I want to get this started because we're only together for 2 short hours today, and John is just a wealth of information. John, thank you so much for joining us, and I turn everything over to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. I am honored to continue the work with the Guild, and I want to say right from the get-go that the focus that the Guild over the last decade or so has placed on the importance of leadership, both within its membership and across the field, is really, really tremendous, and getting to be a part of that is really enjoyable for Jessica and Kimberly and all of us at Partners in Performance. So thank you for inviting me in today. So hello, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here and seeing the list. I know some of you, and there are a number of you that I'll be meeting for the first time today. So thank you for agreeing to be here and to be with us. And in this theme of visionary leadership, managing the present with an eye on the future, we'd ask a question of you as we get started. So what I would ask you to do is just to think together for a minute about this prompt. What's a question that you have on your mind that's prompted you to sign up for this time together? You could be having a long lunch, you could be out raising more money, you could be attending a class, you could be in rehearsal, you could be doing a lot of things, but you've chosen to be here for these 2 hours. So I wonder if you just think about this for a minute or so. What's something that's on your mind that's prompted you to sign up for this time together, discussing something called visionary leadership, managing the present with an eye on the future? And if you would, as you contemplate this a bit, just go ahead and toss your questions into the question box. So we'll have those, and as we move through the day together, we'll have those as reference points. And I also want to remind you that we will leave ample time at the end today where it will be driven exclusively by your questions. So just take, let's say, 2 minutes and just ruminate on the prompt a bit and just drop your response into the question box. Thanks. So thank you all. I see those popping up, and I really appreciate it because I think, again, it helps us make sure that we're grounding the Q&A period today in some things that are on your mind at the beginning, and then there may be other questions that are prompted throughout the time together today. And what I would ask you to do as we're moving through the material, when something comes into your mind that is prompting a response or a question, go ahead and type that in rather than saving it till the end, because then I think we get a richer roster because your question is being intuitively posted as the idea comes to you. So feel free to just jot those questions in at any time. One thing that I would like to do as we start this work is just talk a little bit about what we mean by visionary leadership. There are as many definitions of leadership as one can imagine. And one of the things that comes into a lot of our minds when we hear visionary leadership is the idea of the person out in front, George Patton with his nickel-plated revolvers, the person who is hard-charging out front with all those followers. And we, over the last while, have developed a bit of a different definition for leadership. And we've been honing this for a while, and it's quite simple, and it has three components. And behaving in ways that bring people together to move things forward. Now, it also has an ethical implication, so hopefully we could insert the word good there between move and things to move good things forward. But we want to talk just a little bit about the three dimensions of this. Our belief is that leadership is fundamentally about behavior. It is informed by what we might think about at 4 o'clock in the morning, but it is really about behavior. So as we keep looking at this definition of leadership, I want to just again illustrate the three components of this definition. The first is that it's about behaviors, and that the way we behave really influences whether or not people tend to come together or whether they work in disparate ways. So behavior is important. The bringing of people together, a fundamental job of leadership is mobilizing other people. And we do that whether we are in a positional leadership stance or whether we're working with a group of peers, a group of volunteers, or a group across our community. But we behave in ways that bring people together or mobilize others. And bringing people together to socialize is one thing. Bringing people together just to chat about stuff is another thing we do. But bringing people together that's purposeful, that is about moving things forward, is what we consider good visionary leadership is about, because the work, even though it's being done in the current moment, is about the future-based aspirations that we have. But we'd like you to just keep in mind this definition of leadership, rather simple, with its three components: behaving in ways that bring people together to move things forward. So we'll hold that in mind as we look at our objectives for the day today. And we're coming together. And the three objectives we had posted, I think, in the description of the webinar, a couple of months ago when James first invited us into the process. So we're going to look at three questions together. How does our work in the present moment serve the future we dream of? And we'll take these in order. And then what questions engage our colleagues in ways that challenge the comfort of the status quo? We all are quite attracted to what we are competent with, what is convenient for us, and what we've become comfortable with. So how do we actually engage the people around us in ways that challenge that comfort, that challenge the status quo? Because all we have to do is look around us and see how the world is shape-shifting continually. And therefore, to get into a routinized existence, which is about the maintenance of the status quo, can be very, very costly when the world is shaping itself in new and different ways and doing that quite rapidly. And then the third is about organizational learning. And we'll describe organizational learning and give it some definitions a little bit later in the time together today. But this idea of bridging between the value that is inherent in past experience and how it serves the future possibilities that we drive our organization toward and that we mobilize people around. So those will be the three objectives that we'll work with as we're together today. So let's look at the first of these. How does our work in the present moment serve the future that we dream of? And I want to talk just a minute about this just personally from my point of view. This topic about the present moment work and how it serves the future we dream of is really important to me for a couple of reasons. One, we help at Partners in Performance, we help organizations with vision and strategy. So many of the themes are really consistent with that kind of work. And moreover, after one lives through a few decades, one has the position to where one can reflect on what some of those present moments have been and how they do or do not serve the future that we dream of. So I become more and more interested in how the things we pay attention to on any given day not only influence that day, yet cascade and have huge influences later on. So again, I said I was going to speak personally. For example, tomorrow I turn 66. And one significant aspect is that's the day I'll be able to file for and draw Social Security. That's the safety net that some of us may remember was created back during the New Deal. For people who you work over a lifetime, there's a means of being self-sufficient afterward. Now, one of the things that I've been looking at over the last few weeks as I prepare for this sort of transition day of being 66 and being eligible for Social Security and Medicare and all those things that come with it, is how much the choices that I made ages and ages and ages ago actually influence the reality that I'm going to be experiencing over the next 2, 3, or 4 decades, hopefully 3 or 4 decades. So I'm graphically reminded of the influence of the decisions that I make in one day has huge influences over on the existence that I will live later on. So when I think back and I look at one of the most startling things that you get from the Social Security Administration is your salary history. From the first time you got a Social Security card and you file taxes right through the current year. So when I look way back there, decades and decades ago, and I look at those 3 years that I worked as a country music DJ making $125 a week, I realized that that choice is really influencing the existence that I will have tomorrow and for the next several years. So it's just a stark and very intimate reminder of the choices that we make over time really influences the future that we are creating for ourselves and for others. Now on the screen you see a picture of this beautiful person. This is my daughter, Merida. My daughter's in her first year of college. She's making more A's than anything else. I'm proud of that. She's pledged a sorority, which I was very, very surprised by. It just doesn't run in our DNA, but she did it anyhow. And she's the first freshman at her school to serve on the executive committee of that sorority. She spent her spring break just a week or so ago in Manchester and Belfast in the UK. And she secured an internship this summer at the American Dance Festival. So I'm very proud of her. But you didn't sign up for the webinar today to hear how proud I am of my daughter. But I do believe there's value in sharing a little bit about the story because it relates to this question of present day activity and future-based reality. And so I work in the arts. I have a 2-bedroom apartment. And like most of us who work in the arts, we are not overly resourced. Yet we want the very best for ourselves and for the future generation. So 15 years ago, I made the decision, and it was very hard to make, for $600 a month to be taken from my pay and put in something called a 529 account. And I had to, in those days, live with the consequences of that, which meant less meals out, less single malt scotch, and less fancy vacation time. But now I have no worry whatsoever about her tuition because that's taken care of. And I don't say that for bragging rights. I just say it to personally illustrate how much choices we make in one day influences the reality we encounter in another day. And so for me to take joy in Merida's experiences at college, to reinforce the good stuff she's doing, challenge the other stuff she might be doing, I can do all of that without worry because of choices that were made some time ago. So this is just a really, really good personal reminder for me about how choice making in one day influences the reality of another day and how managing the present some 15 years ago and across that span of time allowed me to create a future which I wanted for myself and for my daughter. So to stay on the personal theme just for another couple of minutes, I have a pretty good relationship with my daughter. And one of the reasons is that a long time ago when she was 6, and I can remember the day I made this commitment to myself, I said, when she's 18, which she is now, I want the same quality of relationship with her that I have today. Not the same relationship, because she'll be 3 times as old, but I want the same quality of relationship today. And I believe that I've achieved that. And one thing that we started doing when she was 7 was a summer road trip together. Always just the 2 of us. She, her mom, and I did other stuff together, but our summer road trip was the 2 of us. Some were short, some were longer, a drive across portions of Canada, some hiking in New Mexico, a week, oh my God, we got a week in Paris one time, museum after museum after museum. And then stepping it up a bit, we spent time in the summer trekking in the high Andes in Peru. And then just last summer, a full month in Africa. And that month included our 8-day summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. I can remember vividly, although it's about 8 months ago now, the tears of anxiety and the jubilation of summiting. They're very vivid as memories for me. And I'm highly confident that there is no way that we would have done what we did together and experienced the exhilaration that comes without the work in all those present moments along the way in getting us there. So again, I'm reminded very intimately of the choices that I make and how I invest my time is going to influence the reality that I have later on. So thank you for indulging those short stories about how, again, the way we manage the present influences the way we live in the future. So what I would like to do is just move on a little bit and just offer a practice that I would ask you to consider. And this practice that I'm offering is one where I'm asking you to basically identify a choice that you need to make now that will better provide for the future you want. And again, if we pretended we were all in a room together doing this work, we would just have 3 minutes of quiet time. You don't need to post these. This is reflective work for yourself, but it could be the beginning of a practice. So what we're inviting you to do is identify a choice that you need to make now that will better provide for the future that you want. So we're going to give you about 3 minutes. You've probably got something that you can write on there. You can open up Word if you like and type it there. But we would ask you just to reflect on this prompt. And this could be the beginning of a real critical practice for each of us to identify a choice that you need to make now that will better provide for the future that you want. So we'll take 3 minutes together while people collect their thoughts, jot these notes down, and it's just a note to self, no need to post these whatsoever. So thank you all very much. Some of you may be finishing up, but I hope you've, again, jotted a couple of reminders to yourself, because this is a great way, I think, for us to do this on our own behalf in a way that offers us ways to then extend this kind of work out into our organizations, which we're going to do next. So what I'm going to do is invite you to look at a couple of practices in which we can, again, work with this first objective about our work in the present moment can serve the world we want in our organizations. So the first of these, I'm going to offer you a tool, and the tool that I'm going to offer you is one that some of you may have worked with, is scenario planning. And by scenario planning, what we mean is that scenario planning is simply a snapshot of the future. And it's a snapshot of the future that takes into consideration some very objective and some very subjective considerations. And the purpose of scenario planning is simple. It's to highlight forces that push the future in different directions. And in highlighting those forces, we end up being able to have a different kind of conversation in our organization. So a scenario is a meaningful snapshot of a future point in time, and it takes into consideration some things that are very objective, like some hard data, and some subjective things like individual perspectives. But the purpose of that planning is to highlight the very forces that are at play that are going to influence the future. So let's look at one of these, and we'll just do a diagram of a scenario. And consider this a what if. So right now, one of the things that we're looking at, if we look at the horizontal axes, we know enough by just watching CNN that public funding, particularly for the arts, is something that may go away and may continue. I know that Arts Advocacy Day was just a week or so ago. I know James was there. I know many, many people were at their state capitals or in Washington, D.C. advocating for continued public funding for the arts. Well, it may go away and it may continue. We know that just at the federal level, that the federal money at the NEA, although it's only $150 million or whatever, really has a huge and significant cascading effect into supporting the regional arts organizations like the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, Arts Midwest, Southern Arts Federation, Western States Arts Federation. It also goes to support and has really been a driver for the creation of arts councils in all of our 50 states and territories. So public funding has a huge effect, and some of us, of course, get grants from the public sources, from our state arts councils, local ones, or from our regional arts organizations, or from the NEA. That may go away or it may continue. We have a choice. We either wait until that happens and then we say, well, gosh, what do we do now? Or we might run some scenarios. So let's look at our earned revenue. Whether you run a school and you've got a number of different sites and you're looking at enrollment may increase over time, it may decrease over time. But running these what-if scenarios with your colleagues is a great way to do what Peter Schwartz, the director of the Global Business Network, says is rehearsing the future. So that's what this is really about. It's about rehearsing the future. So here we have these two possibilities that public funding may continue or may go away, and earned revenue may rise or may fall. Let's look at what might happen in these boxes. So if we were having a conversation and we said, my goodness, folks, what would happen if this public funding goes away, that our earned income really rises? Someone might say, wow, wouldn't that be a real opportunity to create a new entry point for contributors in our organization? Because our participants, those who pay tuition for their kids to participate in our school programs, they don't have tons of money, but maybe we need an entry point at that $10 or $25 level to get those folks even more fully vested and to augment the fact that our public funding is going away. So a scenario that we might run if public funding goes away and participation and earned income rises is we might really want to cultivate more of our participants as donors, because that would be an area of real leverage for us, and it would be a great way to respond to this possible scenario. The other thing we may want to do, because if that public funding goes away, we may have to reduce staff size. So this may be a great opportunity to begin to build a volunteer base. And it may be great that we can now afford to pay a registrar, but if we couldn't afford to pay a registrar, could we do that on a voluntary basis? So again, we're just using examples of what kind of responses that you can generate by having a future-based conversation based on scenarios that may or may not happen. So let's look at another one of these that could happen. That could be scenario A, if public funding goes away and earned income rises. Let's say public funding continues and our earned income also rises. My goodness, that would be a time to really venture out and look at how we might reconfigure, redesign, and improve our programs. We know that getting into the digital domain is something that we've talked a lot about. If this opportunity created itself, that may be a great time to move into digital delivery and digital engagement, something that we've just not had the resources to do before. You know, and our organization we're balancing our budget, but you know, no reserves, no endowment. If this scenario played out, that might be an organizational and institutional priority that would be very important for organizational to pursue. So if scenario B played out, this is sort of the best of all worlds in this particular scenario. Public funding continues, earned income continues to rise. These may be responses that we would have to scenario B. But things don't always work out that rosy. Things work out in different ways. So let's look at scenario C, where public funding does continue, but boy, those new programs we rolled out are just not getting the traction that we thought. We may need to respond to that in ways that are prudent, yet continue our capacities to be sustainable in delivering quality programs. Streamlining management may be something that we know we would need to do. So running out models now for how we might do that is a way for us to understand the consequences of particular choices, versus having to do that on the fly or do that with great immediacy with no understanding of what the consequences may be. So streamlining management might be a response. Another response might be, wow, this is an opportunity for us to really leverage this public funding, which we're blessed is continuing. We got to leverage this into increasing local contributions. And in doing that, maybe two things would happen. One, we got more money in the coffers, so we have to do less streamlining. And we also can make a strong case back now to our public funder, the city, the county, the state, or even the national endowment, of how we have put this money to good use. So the scenario C might have dimensions like the two that we've outlined here. Now, let's look at the scenario where the public funding goes away and our earned income goes down. What would we do as a response as an organization? Well, as Peter Schwartz says, let's rehearse that future. While we're flush, while we are able to do that without the intimidation factor of the reality landing on us and having to respond immediately. What programs might we reduce and where there are the expense cuts? If we were to think about allied effort, where we might work with another organization, or we might even think of merging with another organization, who might those organizations be? And even if scenario D doesn't play out, this particular practicing of this scenario identifies for us allies which could increase our reach, increase our sustainability, and position us in a way to reach into parts of the community we never have before. So this idea of scenario planning is taking any kind of dimensions. Here we just arbitrarily chose public funding because it's pretty topical. And we choose earned revenue because I think everybody on the call has earned revenue streams of some sort. And we thought, let's run out 4 scenarios on this and just see what some responses might be. But what I think we would ask you to imagine here is any what-if scenario that you've got allows you to move into a visionary conversation, a conversation about the future. So this particular managing of the present by running scenario planning is a way for you to keep an eye on the future, and it is a tremendous way to involve your staff, your board, and others into a highly generative conversation, because all the consequences don't have to play out tomorrow. It may be terrific and scenario B plays out. Wonderful if it does, but we're prepared for that. But even if the exact opposite, scenario D, plays out, we're in some way more prepared for that because we've had the conversations in advance. So again, scenario planning offers you a tool through which you can manage the present by putting in place a process like this, and a way to keep your eye on the future, understanding that it is likely going to play out in one of these 4 scenarios. Another tool that we would offer you to think about is something that we began to use a lot more, and we really find it is a great way to have a conversation about things when the stakes are high, but allows everybody into the conversation in a way that allows for great reciprocity. So I'm just going to walk us through this polarity map, and I'm going to start by just identifying what we mean by the 2 boxes on the left and right. Doing the work, that's just doing the work, getting people into the classes, getting the rehearsals done, getting the money raised, getting the subscription brochure out. The doing of the work is something that any organization has to focus on. There's no question about that. We've got to focus on the doing of the work. At the same time, if we only focus on doing the work, what about building the enterprise? What about building a sustainable venture which can serve generation after generation after generation and get us stronger and stronger and stronger over time? So what the polarity map allows us to do is to begin to understand the consequences of paying less or more attention to these 2 responsibilities, and where we're using doing the work of the organization and building the organization, you can use a polarity map for many different reasons. You can imagine in these 2 boxes staying with the status quo, moving into the future. But for now today, we're just going to work with doing the work of the organization and building the enterprise. And what we will start with is we're going to look at what are the downsides of just single focus on doing the work. If you only focus on getting the work of the organization done, one of the consequences is people will say, well, here it's pretty short-sighted. We just basically work on the to-do list. We do what needs to get done in order to stay afloat day to day. And that short-sightedness and that to-do list can lead people to thinking here it's about the task, it's never about the vision. All I do is come in every day, hang up my coat, and work on the pile on my desk. So that would be the kind of reality that people would live within if we only focused on doing the work. Now, none of us would want to do that, but reminding ourselves of the consequences of focusing on the short term, on just the getting of the work done, is a really good reminder of the implications that would have for the people around us. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to only focus on doing the work. So let's look at some of the advantages then on focusing on the building of the enterprise, the building of the organization. One of those that is hugely important is it allows us to really focus on the impact we're looking at having, not only the program we're delivering, but the impact that we want it to have. What kind of lives we want people to lead. What kind of influence we want the program to have on our community, its livability, the cognition of the people who live there and participate in school, closing the opportunity gap, whatever the impact is that we want our organization to have. It also allows us to focus on the sustainability of the enterprise. What are the systems and structures that would need to be in place for our organization over time to flourish? And that brings us to the third point, the legacy beyond you. You're there now. You're the CEO. You're building the footprint. At the same time, when you exit or when your primary board members rotate off, or when a particular set of conditions influence the organization, what's the legacy going to be? How does the organization continue decade after decade to continue to influence the world in the way that it's currently doing? So here we're looking at the benefit of focusing on building the enterprise. Now, at the same time, focusing all the time on impact, sustainability, and the legacy in the long term can drive people crazy. There are some downsides to that. because people say, wait a minute, it's all about the means and not about the end. It's about the means and not the end. The means meaning the organization building as the ends. Things can fall through the cracks. And the third thing that can happen when you're focusing on building, people can feel like it's always talking about the future, yet we're not talking about the good work that we're doing. So if there's downsides to focusing on building the enterprise, there are tremendous upsides to focusing on the work that we're currently doing. And some of those benefits to focusing on the work that we're currently doing are very clear and evident to us. The first of those, when we focus on the work that we're doing, people feel in the moment, really connected. That flow that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about when we're doing the work in rhythm with our community. And there's great gratification that comes with that. And you want people to feel emotionally connected to the work that we're doing. So focusing on the current work is really important. Another reason to focus, it sustains momentum. We understand how today relates to tomorrow. So yes, there's a to-do list there, but boy, as I move through that, I'm actually moving the good work of the organization forward. The third thing about the focusing on the doing of the work that is really advantageous, we really focus on the quality of the immediate engagement. So as you look at this map, and we've just walked through the focusing on doing the work, which is very, very near term, and the focus on building the enterprise, which is a much, much more longer term investment. What I would ask you to do is just imagine in your minds this infinity symbol, which we've drawn, just always moving that northward. You always want to move that northward. So you want to have a universe in which people are feeling really connected and in the moment. Momentum is sustained. Quality of delivery is important. At the same time, we're focusing on the impact we want to have generation after generation. We're building an organization which will be robust and will be sustainable over time. And when any of us leave, the good work will continue. We understand these downsides to any particular exclusive focus on one or the other, but we're focusing on the upsides. So polarity mapping is a really good way to find what I think some people refer to as the balance between focusing on what we're doing and focusing on what we're building. Jim Collins, who I think did a great amount of research and a good amount of writing about organization building, he talked about any of us at any given time might be perceived as either time tellers or clock builders. And he would say that time tellers are people who just focus on the here and now, the getting the work done and the doing of the work. Clock builders are ones who are building the enterprise. I take a bit of issue with Collins because I think we have to do both. I don't think we can only be clock builders. We have to tend to the minutia of getting things done and getting things done in ways where people feel in the moment. Momentum gets sustained, and we focus on the immediate engagement and the quality of those engagements. And at the same time, we are building something that is going to be significant, substantial, and lasting. And to build something lasting, we need to focus on and communicate long-term impact. We need to build something that is sustainable, and we need to build something that will outlive ourselves. So again, here, as you look at the map, just imagine moving the infinity symbol northward, and those two upper quadrants are what we're looking to find the balance within. So again, as we did with scenario planning, we're inviting you to think of polarity mapping as another way to bring your organization and your colleagues into a very, very useful discussion about the near term and the long term. So with that in mind, and I'm hoping you'll just fill the question box as much as you can with things that we can discuss a bit later on. And I see that some are coming in about the negative interpretation of polarities, and I hope we can get to those a bit later. So with this, we'd like to take, I think, another quick time out and just give you another reflective moment. And so here's what we would ask you to do. We've given you both scenario planning and a polarity map as tools. And what we, with those tools in mind, and I know there are others, we would ask you to look at another practice. What can you do today? And what might you call on others to do that's in service to the world your organization is here to create? So we're asking you to step out of the day-to-day for 3 minutes and just think about What could you do today or tomorrow, or within the next week, within your organization? And what might you call on others to do that would be in service to the world your organization is here to create? So we'll just ask you, you might say, gosh, I think scenario planning would work beautifully for our organization. I think it fits our culture. You might say experimenting with a priority map would be great. Or for others of you, there may be other questions or dilemmas that you think it would be great to invite people into. There is no right answer to these practices, folks. It is a matter of just naming for ourselves, when it's fresh on our mind, what we might could do today, tomorrow, the next day, and what we might call others to do that would be in service to what our organization is here to create. So again, we'll take about 3 minutes. We'll invite you into that reflection. Don't need to post anything. This would be for your own work, but about 3 minutes together, and then we'll come back. Okay, I hope you had a chance to just jot some things down as notes to yourself that you might take away from the time together today and actually think about putting those into practice. One of the questions that someone said, in a given week, what's a healthy ratio or balance of time spent on the micro, the day-to-day, and the macro or the future? I'm reminded of a quote from Ron Heifetz, and I admire Ron Heifetz, and we've actually been able to bring him into some of the programs that we've done. If you don't know Ron's work, he runs the leadership program at the Kennedy School of Government in Boston at Harvard. Not the business school, this is the School of Government, and he runs the leadership program there. His most seminal book, I think, is Leadership Without Easy Answers. But one of the things that I remember Ron saying is the need for organizations to keep the vision in constant conversation. So while I think we strive for balance, and we want to know sort of how much time should we spend on this and how much time should we spend on that, I think sometimes it's about balance, and sometimes it's just keeping everyone mindful of what's the point. There's a great phrase, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And the way that we can make sure that the main thing remains the main thing is by talking about the main thing. So I think that one thing that does not work, although I get to do a lot of these, the annual retreat where the organization summons everyone together. There's 2 days, and everybody talks about the future and how grand it could be, and then everybody goes back to work. Well, I think retreats can be very profound, and I have seen them alter organizations significantly. I have seen organizations to decide to go through dissolution. I have seen organizations decide to merge. I have seen many, many major choices made through the retreat process. But I think letting everything about the future build up into one conversation once a year is inconsistent with Heifetz's guidance about keeping the vision in constant conversation. So one of the things I believe, and as we move into the next section, that doesn't help answer this question about how much time, because I'm wondering if it's a time question. I would leave us right now just with Heifetz's point about keeping the vision in constant conversation. But what I do believe is there's a series of questions that if we engage in with our colleagues, they allow us to do two things. One, challenge the comfort of the status quo, but two is explore what the future territory might actually be like. So what I'm going to do is just offer a series of questions, and then you'll have another practice that you will do. So here are some questions that I think help us mediate between the status quo and the future. So the first one, why does what we do matter? For whom does it matter? And how is what we are doing making the kind of difference we want to see in the world? Now, one thing you will see right away, there is no clear, evident answer. These are not yes or no questions. They're not check the box questions. These are questions that drive very challenging, very stimulating conversations in an organization. And they are not easy to answer. And that therein lies their richness. So I believe an organization can carry any one of these questions around for a while. So if you imagine, if you pose this question at a meeting tomorrow, could be board, could be staff, could be whomever, you're teaching artists, any, and just pose this question and says, you know, a month from now, I just want to sit for 3 hours and I'd just like to hear our perspective on this. I think that's a way to honor what Heifetz is saying and keeping the vision in constant conversation is asking questions which are really tough ones. So one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, why does what we do matter? For whom does it matter? And how is what we are doing making the kind of difference we want to see in the world? Gathering 10 perspectives, 30 perspectives, 50 perspectives around this question is a great way, I think, to tee up conversations about the future, which are not limited in scope, but which are very expansive in scope. So this question would be very different than if you were to say, does what we're doing even matter? There, what you're going to get is basically two camps, those who think it does and those who think it doesn't, and an argument ensues. These are questions which enrich a dialogue, but don't stimulate an argument. There's no right or wrong answer to these questions. There are perspectives for people who are fully vested in what you do, and having them articulate that point of view is a great way of understanding what it is that we're doing today, because that's what it's asking. What does what we do, why does what we do matter? That's a way of managing the present. But the way we keep our eye on the future is asking, how is what we are doing making the kind of difference we want to see in the world, which is a future-based orientation. So this question, just in its construction, honors this whole theme for today about managing the present, why does what we do matter, and keeping an eye on the future. Are we making the kind of difference we want to see in the world, which is a future-based question. So I think this is a great way to just interrogate what we're doing. Another one is, what makes our current priorities the right ones? Boy, there's no easy. That's a confounding one. Someone might say, well, what makes our current priorities the right ones is because it's the ones that we can get funding for. So that's a very pragmatic response and a very legitimate response. And then we want to continue to peel away at that. So if the current priorities are the right ones because they're fundable, What is the question that we want to ask in response to that, to dig deeper into that? What is it about these programs that make them fundable as opposed to we just do them and people want to sustain them? Is it about the impact? Is it about the people that we're engaging that other organizations are not finding a way to engage? So any of these offer a rich gateway into several questions that can certainly cascade from these. So another question that allows us to challenge the comfort of the status quo. What makes our current priorities the right ones? And this one I love. This I carry with me everywhere because I find it just drives a fascinating set of responses. What are we doing out of habit or simply because we've gotten good at it? You know, we can ask that personally as well as we can ask it of our organization. So what are we doing out of habit or simply because we've gotten good at it? And with those responses in hand, what needs to change in order to make us more responsive to our constituents? So ever more responsive can be a great driver toward the future. But what are we doing out of habit or simply because we've gotten good at it? And what needs to change in order to make us more responsive to our constituents? Another question that we find really helps challenge this comfort of the status quo. And folks, these are meant to do that. This is literal. These are meant to challenge the comfort of the status quo. They are not make nice questions. They are hard questions. They're tough questions. What long-held assumptions should we be challenging? Maybe where we fit into the local cultural ecology, where we are physically, what our priorities are. So what long-held assumptions should we be challenging? And when we name those assumptions that we should be challenging, what's a hypothesis that's really worth testing? What can we go out and test? So a long-held assumption might be, just to go back to something we were talking about earlier, the people who pay for our programs can't or wouldn't contribute. That may be an assumption that an organization could carry. Maybe because your constituency is lower income than you are, or that the average is in your community. So an assumption that could naturally flow from that is people who are paying for our programs can't also contribute to our organization. Well, that's a hypothesis that may be worth testing, and it's a pretty easy test. You gather 6 or 8 or 10 of them together and you have a conversation. You illustrate your budgets, you illustrate your forecasts, you talk about the power of contributed revenue. You're not there to advocate for them to contribute, but then you can just ask them, is contributing something that could be a part of your future? And if so, what kind of entry point might we create that would be helpful to us and workable for you? So any assumption is worth challenging. And if you're going to challenge the assumption, you got to have a hypothesis, and then you got to test that. So the assumption is people of lower income who pay for our programs won't contribute or can't contribute. A hypothesis worth testing would be that, and then we get to get them together and ask. You don't survey, you bring people and have a listening session. You don't advocate for them to do it, you ask them about it. But you ask through it by being very disclosing as to the structure of the enterprise, as to the importance and criticality of contributed revenue, as to who else contributes, how much you contribute as an individual. So you set up this conversation where you really can test the hypothesis. So a final one that we think is also useful in this, what opportunities are we pursuing in union with others so we can increase the impact we are having and assure our resources go even further? I'm reminded, because I'm a great admirer of what Big Thought does in Dallas and what they have done over time. And I just had a group of leaders, emerging leaders, who spent a day in Dallas with Gigi and everybody there. And it's really fascinating about what can happen through allied effort. And I do believe, and this is where I'm sharing an opinion, although this question is asked neutrally, that most nonprofits, and I would include, I think, a number of you on the call, and you could challenge me on this, could achieve much more, could enable many more good things to happen in the world if we were working more in union with others. And sometimes the independent nature that has built up around our organization, the fighting for funds, the independent nature, the clarity and uniqueness of our vision. All of those things can sometimes be really good surrogates for us not to investigate how we might work with others. But as a thought experiment for an organization, I see no downside. So to imagine asking this fifth question of your programming people, of your faculty, of a bunch of constituents, and just pose the question about what opportunities might be there in working in union with others, you might be very surprised by the responses, and there might be new and different opportunities that would bubble up from that. So we would consider these questions as ways through which you are, again, managing the present, but keeping an eye on the future. And in particular, you are investigating this question of challenging the status quo. So we would like to, with these in mind, offer you a third practice for the day. And this practice is ask questions of yourself and your colleagues for which there are no easy nor immediate answers. So what we're going to do in these 3 minutes is just ask you on your sheet of paper or on your laptop, just name some questions that you think are timely for yourself or for you and your colleagues that don't have easy answers and don't have an immediate response that you feel someone can summons. Those questions would be questions that are not yes or no questions. They would be questions over which the responder is the sole authority over that response. So you're not setting up an argument. You're actually setting up a rich reservoir of data and information and perspective, which you likely don't have currently. So just, are there some questions that you think are worth asking, don't have easy answers, but might be timely for your organization? So again, 3 minutes, notes to yourself, and then we'll push on. Thanks. Okay, we'll come back together. Thank you. I hope you have some questions there that you might want to put in play or refine. And if any of you would like to chat about any of those at any time, be sure and be in touch. I really enjoy that kind of work. And I think the crafting of these questions in ways that they will be engaged around is a real skill. So we actually achieve that by practicing it more and more. One of the questions that came up a few minutes ago was, how can we best lead from below or on the side when people in roles of authority are displaying their anxiety in ways that affect the workplace and the team? Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know how unique it is. I feel that it's rather pervasive and it's not unique to one organization. So this whole idea of how can we best lead from below or the side when people in authority are displaying their anxiety in ways. The one thing I believe that we can do in that, and again, this sounds like a quick answer, but I think it's such a rich question and maybe other people would have thoughts as well, is going back to the definition of leadership about behaving in ways that bring people together to move things forward, the one thing we can do from any place that we sit within the organization is we can, through our own behavior, illustrate for other people, including the anxious positional leader, pardon me, our confidence in the organization and its capacity to move forward. So expressing things like, I'm uncertain exactly how, but me and my colleagues feel really strongly that we're able to do this. So I think it's communicating that aptitude, communicating that capacity, communicating that optimism about the capabilities of the organization. The other thing is, depending on the culture of your organization and the relationship with the positional leaders, you can simply have a conversation and say, John, I know as the executive director, God, this work must come with huge upsides and downsides. And one of the things I sense is you really worry about all of us. And my God, it's really great that someone does. But I'd really like to have a conversation from what I notice amongst us and just, again, share this in real time with the individual. And again, this is all dependent on the culture and the relationships you have. But this whole idea of anxiety at the top may be certainly conditioned by that leader feeling very isolated. So how can I work in ways that will further reduce the isolation this individual may feel? And I think we do that through gestures of camaraderie. We do that through gestures of optimism. We do that through hopeful gestures. And we do that by asking questions that are appropriate to the relationship. So I hope that helps a bit. And it's a very, very good question because it's a fairly pervasive reality in our organizations, particularly with folks who are in executive leadership positions. So we want to push on a little bit to, I think, our third area we were going to talk about today, about organizational learning and how can organizational learning bridge between our past experience and future possibilities. So first of all, it might be good just to look at a definition of organizational learning. And by the way, there's a million definitions out there. So here's the one that we've sort of cobbled together out of a number of different responses. And we use this in our work in the intelligence community and different places that we're doing work these days. Organizational learning is where the organization facilitates the learning of its members. Now, I know that may sound like it's just sort of repeating. Organizational learning is organizational learning. No, it's a facilitated learning. That means that there's a huge amount of reciprocity. What I know becomes what you know. So the learning that remains latent is exposed and shared, and through the sharing of what each person knows, we develop a shared awareness, shared consciousness, and I would argue in many cases, shared commitment. The shared awareness is the basis of that. So we facilitate the learning of its members, member to member. So having a conversation at a staff meeting that, you know, we got to raise $2.5 million this year. I'd love it if we could just start off by I want to give you 5 minutes to think on this. And I'd love not just the development people, but I'd love everybody just to respond to the following question. What's your sense? What's your sense of the mood of the community? What's your perspective on what is worth trying that we've not tried before? So just here again, sharing perspectives is a great way to facilitate the learning of member to member. And it's the process through which we bridge past experience and future possibility. So organizational learning, as defined thusly, I want to explore this a bit by looking at something we're now calling the Birmingham model. And the reason we're calling it the Birmingham model is one of the projects that we're so blessed to work with is the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham, Alabama. This is a fabulous organization, and it's an organization that's been around since the early 90s. We first became associated with the Civil Rights Institute back about 5 years ago when we were helping with a strategic alliance among 3 organizations, a museum in Charlotte, a history center in Atlanta, and the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham, who were looking at the reality that the Latino population in these 3 communities and across the Southeast was exploding. But nothing in these 3 organizations, no object on their walls, no staff member, no board member, no docent, no volunteer. This community was absolutely unrepresented within these 3 organizations. So the Strategic Alliance, Latino New South, was a way for these 3 organizations to investigate how it might be more responsive and more legitimate in its responses to the burgeoning Latino populations in its 3 communities. So in facilitating that effort, we got to know the people at the Civil Rights Institute. And as you may know, one of the last acts before leaving office, President Obama named the Civil Rights Institute as the most recent national monument. So now the Civil Rights Institute, the 16th Street Baptist Church across the street, the Gaston Hotel behind it, and Inman Park beside of it is this new national monument. So boy, the pressure is on in this organization because visitorship is going to be exploding. It is a national monument, it's on the registry, and all those great things are going to be happening. The dilemma is the Civil Rights Institute was formed out of a black-white reality in Birmingham and across Alabama and sadly across America. But now, 30 years on, this organization is working in a technicolor world. It is working where many, many different parts of our population are striving for human rights and civil rights. So it really has to reimagine its mandate, its mission, and do that in ways that are consistent with the world as it's coming at us. So this work about organizational learning is something that we have been in our collaboration with the Institute working on over the last while. So here's what we have been doing. The Civil Rights Institute, we, in this, what we're calling the Birmingham model, are looking at how we can bridge past experience and future possibilities. And we're doing this through a process of asking a set of sequenced questions. And I'm just going to share those questions with you because I think they're the best way to just illustrate the model. So one of the things we're asking people is, first of all, this is for staff, board, volunteers, and vested community members. We're asking first about their emotional connection to the organization. This is a very right brain question. What has the Institute accomplished that for you is deeply meaningful? This is a way to understand what drives people's discretionary effort, their discretionary giving, their commitment to the organization over time, and what for them gives this organization meaning. So that's the first question that we're asking for folks to wrestle with. The second is moving over to the left brain pretty quickly and asking people to be more logical, asking people to be more discerning, and to say, what have we learned over time that will serve us as we look to the future? And I find this step in planning processes left out time after time after time after time. The organization is sitting with a trove of good knowledge that is never named, never harvested, never curated, and never implemented in moving forward. So being very direct in this question is a great way for any organization to really bridge between the learned experience, the lived experience of the organization and the future possibilities. So what have we learned over time that will serve us as we look to the future? So these two questions we posed first as a suite of questions, asking the first one, and boy, the stories that were told, I mean, I get shivers just thinking about them here. The people who were actually foot soldiers in the movement in the 50s and the 60s, telling the stories of the deep, meaningful connection they have to this organization. And then those same people talking about over decades the lessons that have been learned that can be in service to the future aspirations as the Civil Rights Institute exploits its responsibility as the newest national monument, as it serves this Technicolor world, and as it opens its doors as a gateway for many, many people who are looking for civil and human rights. So those two questions were a way to, again, illustrate what we might call past experience. And then we moved to talking about the future. Well, we said to them, and this is where we employed storytelling, imagine it's 2025, and again, in any organization, use the time span that's best for that organization. You're sitting with someone close to you. Someone said, oh, it's my child who's now in high school. They'll hopefully be in graduate school by that time, and when they come home, I'd be sitting with them. Somebody else said, it's a neighbor that I've known for 50 years who's been in the struggle with me, and I would be sitting with them. So we asked people to actually name this person. So imagine it's 2025. You're sitting with someone close to you. The Institute comes up. What story would you want to tell them? And I'm telling you, folks, I have never been so moved in my life by these stories as they were told by 25 or 30 people. They were so powerful in the way they used metaphor, the way they used the care and consideration for oncoming generations. So this whole idea of storytelling is a great way for people to begin to name future possibilities. And it gets you away from goals, objectives, strategies, tactics, and all that garbage that we often use as a way to contemplate the future. This is human language. This is about what a human being wants to be able to say to another human being. And those stories become the basis then for developing the strategy and the vision. But boy, it's so different than starting with goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics. It's just so powerful. And the vocabulary which emerges, the way of speaking to the future, the way of speaking about the future is so potent. So we asked this question. And then we said, that, so that's very right brain again, the emotional, visceral connection people have with the organization. And then we said the fourth question was, so, okay, that's well and good, powerful stories. Every one of them moves us to action. So now knowing us as you do, knowing our good tendencies, our less than good tendencies, knowing our strengths and weaknesses, what's now required of us to be successful in making this story a reality? So this is asking, again, to move back to the left brain, people to be very discerning, name the requirements. We are going to have to be much more assertive at generating contributed revenue. We are going to have to ally ourselves with organizations we've never thought of being in alliance with before. We are going to have to upgrade the quality of our curatorial capacity in the organization. So what I offer in these four questions is this way of, again, bridging between past experience, which are what the first two questions are asking, and moving to the future possibilities or aspiration, which are what the second two questions are asking for. And if we do that, I think in this way, we are asking for the emotional, visceral, personal connection to what's happened and what people want to see happen. And we're asking for the very discerning view of the hard-won lessons and the hard to accomplish requirements the organization is now going to have as it moves forward. So what I would ask you to do with those in mind and just the Birmingham model in your mind is do our fourth and final practice of the day. And this practice we would share with you as the final one. So this practice is asking you to think about facilitating a present process that bridges between past and future. I've just shared with you the Birmingham model. I'm asking you in 3 minutes to think about your organization. And I'm asking you what you might see as a way through which the organization could facilitate a process. Right now means now or within the next year, okay? That would bridge between the lived experience, the past, and the future, the aspiration. So you can steal anything you want from the Birmingham model if it's useful. You may have very, very different questions, but I'm just asking you to take 3 minutes and identify what would you see happening as a way for your organization to really bridge between the lived experience, what's happened, the value and integrity of what's happened, the lessons embedded within that, and the future that we want to achieve, because this is, again, all about visionary leadership and the future that we would want to achieve. So 3 minutes, your own notes to self, and then we'll move into questions for the last 15 minutes, and we'll share 3 or 4 resources that we hope you'll follow up with. So 3 minutes. Okay, I hope you had some time to jot some thoughts to self there, and we want to make sure that we're finished on time today, and 2 hours is a lot to contribute to this kind of process with your colleagues, so we want to make sure that we break by 3, so I want to make sure that we're leaving time for questions. So if we might move into some questions now, and I've got some that have been posted that I want to just share a couple of responses with, and then there are some resources that we also want to share. And so I'm just going to read a question that comes from one of you who says, what can leaders who tend more toward being clock builders can do to balance their thinking more with doing the work, and what can time tellers do to balance their perspective more with building the enterprise? Great question. One is, and it depends on where you are in the organization. I mean, if you're the executive director and you set a lot of the conditions, I think that's where I would start. How do you create conditions? Influence behavior. Conditions always influence behavior. And the conditions we create a lot of times are the way in which people get the signals as to what in our organization is important and what's less important. So this whole idea of finding, getting clock builders to do more balancing their work with doing the work, and just and where the time tellers are focusing more on building the enterprise. One is, I think, signaling that both are important and useful, and that you are being transparent on how they are going to be investigating. So if you're not transparent, the people who trend more toward the time telling are going to likely stay there, because they feel if we're only going to talk about clock building or the longer term, my focus is here. And you have people with different preferences. So I think the more candid and clarifying you can be about the different kind of conditions that you're going to create, and actually create time where each of these can be discussed. So, for instance, if we want to have a conversation that is about both time telling and clock building, here's a very useful question. What's our view on the effectiveness of what we're currently doing? And gather those views. So people are talking about effectiveness. What's your view on the effectiveness of what we're currently doing? And illustrate the views that people have on that. And then with that roster, and I'm imagining them up on the wall because I try to always put things up on the wall because I think if everybody can look at them together, you get a different kind of response. You say, with that as our view, and we're here committed to doing the best job that we're capable of doing, what options are open to us? What options are open to us? I don't think you want to say what improvements, because an option might be, maybe we should not stop being a mile wide and an inch deep, and we should try going an inch wide and a mile deep, if you get the point, breadth and depth, right? So if we just go with how can we, what improvements can we make, people often go to tweaking. But I think if you ask this question about what options are open to us, people may say, an option that's open to us is to do less programs and do less programs far better. And then certainly somebody has the response, well, but we've got funding for all of them, so if we lose funding, then we're in trouble. But I think what options are open to us is a much more helpful and open gateway into the responses than it is if we ask people for what improvements can we make, which often is tweaks around individual programs. So one of the questions that I think people ask is around creating the conditions is very important. Another question, in teeing up a dialogue around these tough questions, what suggestions do you have to get people in the right mindset to be challenged and not become defensive? Great question. Again, I'm going back again to conditions influence behavior. If you're going to have a discussion, which you really need a time out of time for, allow more time than you think you'll need. That's the first rule of thumb. Because if you don't allow enough time and you just start unpacking them, and people think the unpacking stuff that's now up on the wall is going to go somewhere, and their stuff is not up there, and they don't agree with all the stuff that's up there, you end up with people getting very defensive very quickly. So I think the first thing is conditions influence behavior. Allow more time than you think you'll need. Have the conversation in a place where you don't normally have the conversation. I don't know that it's so much a recommendation to have a neutral space. I don't know that neutral is the right word, but a different space. So if you always meet if the board always meets in the boardroom at Susie's law office, don't have this discussion around the big mahogany table. Have it in the rehearsal hall. Have it somewhere else. Have it at a community space that you've never been in, but you know a lot of your constituents visit a lot. But I think have the conversation in a space that will allow people just to enter into the discussion with a different perspective. The other thing is give people fair notice about what you're going to be discussing. What I see happen over and over again, and those of you I think that have been in CALE would be very well aware of this, or those of you who have done Myers-Briggs would be aware of this. When you just throw really tough or great questions in front of people with no chance for reflection, you're going to get the good talkers moving to the fore very quickly. And you're going to hear the 50% of the room who are extroverts leap right in and give you great energizing stuff. And you're going to leave the other 50% of the people listening. And the thing that we know, and the thing we know from Susan Cain's research and her wonderful book, Quiet, the role of the introvert in a world that can't stop talking. And if you haven't read it, it's in paperback now. I urge you to get it because you'll never do your meetings the same way again. So the third thing I would say, in addition to the space that you choose, is let people know well in advance the questions you're going to investigate together, because some of us want time to reflect on it. And then when you pose the question, we're more willing to jump in. I always think when the questions are tough or real rich or real good and they're not easily answerable, do a go-round at the beginning for the first of those questions and say, I'd just love to start with Joe over here and finish up with Susie over here and hear each of you respond to this first question with your perspective. Let's get that stuff rostered and then we'll open up into a conversation. So, because you're always wanting to create equity and parity in the conversation. And creating equity just along an introversion-extroversion scale is really helpful. The other thing where you need to be really conscious of creating equity and parity is around how long people have been in the organization. Sometimes the person who's new can be summarily disregarded because they just haven't been here long enough to know where everything happens. But boy, that's a huge mistake, folks. That's a huge mistake, particularly when interrogating these kind of questions. Because the new person is able to see things in ways that the rest of us have long ago forgotten how to see, because they have fresh eyes on the system. They have fresh views of what they're hearing. They are not tainted by the patterns that the rest of us have fallen into place with. So I think a really, really good rule of thumb is that you let people know in advance. You create equity in your conversation around introverts and extroverts. You create equity in the participation from people who've been around a long while and people who've been around a short while. The other thing to do in this kind of dialogue, give people one-on-one time. Don't have everybody just talking in the group, because you can end up with group speak. Push people back in ones and in groups of two. Give people individual reflective time. Have them in groups of 3. I've done a lot of work with urban bush women in the past 2 years. And one of the favorite questions, and I just used this question out in Boise a week ago, and I used it in Birmingham, and I used it somewhere else. It's a great way. So you've got 10 people around the table. You say to folks, look, before we jump into our conversation today, I've got a question for you, and here's the prompt. If you really knew me, you would know that, and so that's the prompt. If you really knew me, you would know that, and what I'd invite you to do is find someone in the group of 10 that you know less well versus someone you know real well, and just have a conversation. And one of you share the other one and see where the conversation goes. I've done this, I'd say, 5 times in the last month in different places that I've been. It is hard for me to get the conversation stopped because people are anxious when they hear the assignment, but then once they jump into it, their conversation goes in so many ways that are wholly unpredictable. And what are they getting to do? They're getting to disclose something about themselves. They're getting to hear something about someone they don't know that well. And this tees up an openness that you just can't get otherwise. And so I give them like 5 minutes, and then at 8 minutes, I'm still begging them to come back and sit down together. So I'm urging you here to think of your organizations as human communities. Think of your organizations not as systems and structures. And although they are complex adaptive systems, they are human communities. So creating the conditions where people feel comfortable in the conversation are really seasoned by you thinking about the conditions you're creating, thinking about the space, thinking about equity of participation, thinking about people getting to know each other one-on-one, so then they're more willing versus less willing to have their views shared within the larger group. So those are just a couple of thoughts that I have on how you can create a space that is more inviting versus less inviting. Just a couple of other questions. How might we as leaders engage and communicate the organization's vision with greater clarity? Great question. I am not a fan of the elevator speech, so I'll just come clear on that. Memorizing elevator speeches is less helpful than continually conversing around the vision so each person in their own words can communicate what the organization means to the future. So I think the one way we can engage and communicate the organization's vision with greater clarity is for people to talk about it more. And it doesn't have to be fancy role play. You can, at a board meeting, you can just say, you know, we've allocated 15 minutes tonight. We just want to keep this vision. We want to keep this conversation of the vision alive. So we're going to be in threes. And what we would love to do is just start by, here's our vision, flash it up on the screen. We're going to be in threes. There'll be 7 groups of 3. And what we'd love to do is just person A, then person B, and then person C. And with this vision in mind, your prompt is, when I read this vision, here's what comes to mind. And person 1 will speak, Person 2 and 3 might ask some clarifying questions, and then person 2 and then person 3. And now in the middle of that group of 3 people, you've got meaning. This is what meaning making is all about. So as opposed to rehearsing the vision, people are talking about what the vision means to them. So this is great practice then for the elevator, because now they meet somebody in the elevator and they can talk about, oh yes, we're about doing this great stuff for kids and curing cancer and all this other stuff. But let me tell you what this means to me. And that's where they get the attention of the person in the elevator, is through the meaning they've made of the vision, not the memorization of the vision. So I think one greater clarity comes through my own capacity to rehearse and better understand what the vision means to me as an individual. And that, I think, is what prompts me to be more courageous and more willing to have a conversation with potential donors, recruiting new board members, talking at the Chamber of Commerce or whatever, rather than trying to memorize the vision. So this whole question, I think, about gaining greater clarity is through gaining greater understanding of individual personal meaning for myself and for others. And that 15 minutes in a group of 3 can be some of the richest time of that evening's meeting. We need to cover the financials. We need to do that. But if we are going to be managing the present with an eye on the future, which is what this 2 hours is about, then we need people to be able to make meaning of the vision that has been declared. Because if you ask people in organizations how long they've been around, many times the mission and the vision were set long before they arrived. So the meaning for them would be quite different from someone else. So I think a great way to bring great clarity is to move toward meaning and away from memorization. Let's see, just some other questions that are here. And James, you've been good enough to send me those. Do you have one just on your mind that you'd like to make sure we pose?
I do, John. This question came in from Suzanne, and you've been talking about this throughout the webinar, but just if you can sort of bullet out a few things, how can I continue to lead my staff in a positive manner, especially when there's negative factors going on in upper administration? And then I'm going to couple that with a question that Tara posed. How can I lead my staff and my community when so many of the issues are deeply impacted by policies in the current political administration? So if I can couple those two together and pose, how can I lead my team through times of adversity and keeping a mind on the future?
I'll conflate those for a minute and focus on the second, and then what I would like to do, James, is come back and ask you maybe to repeat the first one again.
Sure.
But as these policy changes and all, we just use the public funding as an example of that. I think as the policies around us are shifting, I believe that this is a phenomenal opportunity for scenario planning, because it allows us to deal with the what if before the what if arrives, before the if arrives. So I think anytime we're feeling constrained by policies, or we're feeling we may be impacted by new policies which are being developed around us, that scenario planning is a great neutral way to begin to identify the implications of these changes on us. And then the next question is, how might we respond to those? So was the question more about policies? Can you just say the second one again?
Sure. More about policy in the current administration and remaining positive and focused.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, there's 2 jobs that we've got if we're going to be good visionary leadership. So we've got to stay calm and we've got to stay optimistic. If we don't do that, then basically we've been co-opted. And the last thing I think any of us on this call want to be is co-opted, because we know the pervasive nature of what's occurring. So remaining calm, I think, in a leadership stance in your organization allows for the richest thinking of your contingency, of your group to be manifest. And I think remaining optimistic does not mean that you're saying, oh, I don't care about what's going on. It means that I care enough about what's going on that I will not be denied the aspirational view I will take of our future. Because if I'm denied that aspirational view of the future, I just don't know where the energy is going to come from in order to fight the good fight that's ahead. And remember, in our working definition of leadership, it's behaving in ways that bring people together. So if the job is mobilizing, whether that's 800,000 people in Washington or 80,000 people in Raleigh, it doesn't matter, or 10 people in our organization. If we're going to mobilize people, we must be optimistic. And I think this whole idea of optimism is very, very important. And do we have barriers that we are likely going to have to move through? Absolutely. But I do think sometimes when the attention is on the barriers, it's like Phil MacArthur, who some of us know from our work with him and his work at Cayley. If the question is, with the things that are happening, what's keeping us from getting our work done with the new policies or whatever? Is a very different question than, with whatever happens, what is going to serve us best in achieving the results that we want? And I think there we're drawing on institutional goodwill, we're drawing on institutional strength. And sometimes I watch and people are talking about the barriers and people are talking about the constraints. They are not talking about the advancement forward. And I think any of that time is quite honestly wasted time. So somehow turning the conversation toward the optimistic response and away from the detrimental policy changes. So somehow keeping the conversation optimistic. And in order to do that, I believe it requires a great degree of, as Marge Piercy says in her wonderful poem, To Be of Use, massive patience. And it's not the patience to let what's happening out in the world just overrun us. It's the patience to galvanize and mobilize our people in ways. And I think any movement that we've looked at, our own civil rights movement in America, the movement was what it was about, not the plan. I heard somebody say the other day, when Martin Luther King spoke in 1963, he didn't say, I have a plan. He said, I have a dream. So I think, again, this optimistic approach to the aspiration of the organization and what's now required of us with the new conditions which we need to engage around in order to achieve success. So I think we've got to draw on optimism as an organizational resource, and we in a leadership position are the first ones who must exhibit that through our behavior.
Thank you so much.
James, what was the first question?
The first question was, hang on, let me go back to it. First question came in from Suzanne. How can I continue to lead my staff in a positive manner when I sense that there are potentially negative factors going on in the upper administration concerning my own program?
Yeah, candor is sometimes hard to come by in an organization. And again, all this is conditioned by the culture that you're in and sort of the ruse of that culture. And I wish we had an hour to just do some illustrations of organizational culture and how they relate so immediately to your question. The reality that we find ourselves in is a reality that we helped co-create. We may have had a large hand in that or a small hand in that. But the groups that are willing to understand and own up to, they on a daily basis are co-creating the reality of which they're a part, are the very groups who have the capacity to move things forward in ways that are often staggering in the results and at the pace in which things can move forward. So one of the things to do is to create a climate where bitch moaning and complaining is the norm. And I certainly visit many of those organizations where that's the case, just like Suzanne has described. And I find that that has no future. Do people need to vent? Yes. Do people need to vent with confidants? Yes. But those are outside the organization. I think inside, people need to work as colleagues, and therefore people need to talk about the steps in which we can take together in order to move things forward within the understanding of our current reality. And sometimes it is the person who is, quote, in charge of that group, is the responsibility is one that requires great courage, is to have a very straightforward conversation with whoever is in the authorizing environment that all this is being put at the feet of. What I find sometimes when I go in and interview, and I do this a lot, I interview across an organization, I'll come in, interview maybe the artistic leader or the academic or curricular leader, interview the president or the CEO, members of the executive committee, and then members of the staff, is the degree of shared misunderstanding is phenomenal. So sometimes cutting through the misunderstanding. So sometimes the boss needs to go to the boss and say, look, what should be my understanding or your view of whatever the dilemma is? Autonomy for the staff, or trying out new experiments in programming, or launching a new program with this ally that we've never worked with before. Again, I don't know exactly the reference point Suzanne is using, but I think sometimes when we go and we ask a neutral question of the boss, we don't come in and loaded for bear, assuming they're the ogre. We go in and say, what should my understanding be of your view of X, whatever X is? Could be an opportunity, could be a feeling of suppression that the staff has about new ideas. But I think going in and asking those questions neutrally and working with the boss as a colleague is really hard work, but I think it's the only work that's legitimate. Because if I go in and say, Joe, I've got a lot of complaints from everybody, and people think that you X, Y, Z. Now, I know that you don't really think that way. All we're doing is making the thing worse. So if we go in and say, what I'd like to get is your view on, and name X with great clarity. And if X is autonomy for the staff, or new adventures, or new ventures, or new alliances, or whatever, then get that view and say, terrific, I've got your view. It is very helpful to understand it. And if the view is one that is actually suppressing X, whatever X is, I think courage helps us make the next step in what conversation do we then want us to have with the boss. But often I find out there's as much misunderstanding that masks itself as conflict. And many, many times, I'd say 6 times out of 10, it is a misunderstanding that needs to be reconciled versus the conflict that needs to be managed. But gosh, Suzanne, I'm happy to talk on the phone at any time just to dig into that just a little bit deeper. James, maybe just 1 or 2 other questions if you've harvested some there.
Sure, John, you've actually hit on most of those questions that have come in. I want to encourage anyone, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat. Now is the time.
And James, maybe while we're doing that, I would just talk about some resources that that we want to share with people that I think I draw on in my work, but also drew on for the development of the presentation today. If polarity management interests any of you, this handy paperback by Barry Johnson is really useful, identifying and managing unsolvable problems. And an unsolvable problem is a problem that is a dilemma. That's what we're talking about when there are polarities. It's a dilemma. We need to focus on the near term. We need to focus on the long term. No one would say we can trade one off for the other. We need to focus on fresh ideas, and we need to do the things that we've proven that we're good at. We can't trade one of those off. That's what he means by unsolvable. They're not solvable by just doing A or doing B. But I do believe that the polarity map, and if you go through it in those quadrants from the lower left to the upper right, to the lower right to the upper left, you map, I think, in the lower 2 boxes, in those 2 quadrants, you map the things that are the negative consequences of a sole focus on either side of the dilemma. And those are usually costly to an organization. And what you've done on the upper two quadrants is you've mapped the opportunities inherent on better management of that polarity. So I find the tool really, really useful. I just used it in Spokane with an organization the other day, and they moved, their dilemma was, is it about our building, which we're here to manage and program, or is it about service to our constituents, because they do a lot of the service off-site. And this was just a gold mine of responses that help them now create a whole new staff structure for optimizing the use of the building, in no way diminishing the quality of their program delivery. So it takes some practice to use it. First time I used it, I just didn't really understand it, but we've used it now a good bit, and as Jessica's aware, and it really, really does work. This article by Amy and Katie Smith and Amy Sexton is The Challenge of Organizational Learning. This offers 4 different barriers to learning in an organization, which is taking the lived experience and actually applying it to where we're going next. It's a long article. I've got it here in my hand. If you print it, it comes to about 10 pages, but it is really, really, really practical. We love reading theoretical stuff, but we really have to get ourselves conditioned by working with the things that are most practical. So you will find that this article, and it talks about how leaders have to be champions for learning. They have to serve as role models for learning. There need to be structures in place, and a structure could be the scenario planning or polarity. It could be the questions that we're using in Birmingham, but there's got to be a structure. And then you got to have a process for filtering what's been learned into decision making. But boy, they give you maps and illustrations that are really helpful for that. And then Peter Schwartz's book, The Art of the Long View, look at the date on that, 1996. I was 12 when that was put out. But I really admired his work, and he's the author of this phrase about rehearsing the future. So The Art of the Long View, planning for the future in an uncertain world, and he used scenario planning as one of the means through which we get there. And then no book has been more important for me personally than Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now. Again, it's in paperback, and this person just lets us understand, doesn't let us off the hook. And when I think of those personal stories I shared at the beginning of today's time together, the power of what we do in the immediate moment and the power it holds over how our lives or our organization's lives or our communities are going to be in the future. It's just compelling work. And he writes with a certain poetry that is quite magical, quite probing, quite deep, and it gives you, I think, a lot to think about. It's a good book just to carry in your briefcase back and forth to work and read on the train and just keep with us. And then my hope is that people would really be in touch with me, because I love nothing more than just talking about things that you might find, questions that you find important, and if there's any way we can talk about them in a way that would be useful. That's just send a note, and unless I'm traveling, I can be in touch with you within usually a day or so. And I would put phone number here, but I'm never by phone, it's always by email. But
John, thank you so much. We had a couple other questions come in. I want to be mindful of our time, so I'm going to rush and ask you those because I think they're really great. When it's hard for you to be optimistic, what do you do to recenter yourself so that you can be an effective, optimistic leader?
Well, other than recreational drugs? No, it's a great question. What I do, my practice is, I take time, and it could be 2 minutes or it could be 15. And when I'm in that precise moment that you all have just described, and I have these a lot. I mean, I'm very nomadic. I travel. I'm in, 100 organizations a year or so. And I walk into some which are highly toxic, yet I want the work to be useful and helpful for people. And I have to prepare myself for the way that people may want to reject the difficulty of the work that I'm going to be offering, the way they want quick fixes versus deep challenges. So yes, boy, do I do that. I take somewhere between 2 minutes and 15 minutes, and I find a place that is absolutely quiet, and I sit and I clear my mind. And when I clear my mind, I find I am more capable of engaging in ways that are honoring the people in the room as opposed to honoring my ideas that I might walk in with. And I know that at the last workshop that I did, when we were at the last conference, I asked people at the beginning of that, because we were going to be dealing with some heady stuff, I asked everybody in the room, we had about 50 people in the room, I asked them to do 2 minutes in the same way. I said, look, I've done this already this morning, so I'll manage the clock for us. I want you to take 2 minutes. And I want you to just put everything aside, just drop it down on the floor. They were in, big rows. And I said, just drop everything on the floor, sit straight, put your back against the back of the chair, put your hands on your knees. And I said, close your eyes. And I said, for 2 minutes, I just want you to just be still. And I said, I'll let you know when the 2 minutes is up, and then we'll start our work. And I don't know that this is true, but I felt the quality of questions, the quality of engagement that day were just significantly different than when I just come in full bore and start pushing people with a bunch of stuff. So that's one way that I do it, James, is just taking that time out of times, clearing my head, clearing the space, and again, so I can go into the group better able to honor what is on their mind than to push what is on mine.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Looks like we have gone silent. There are no more questions. John, do you have any final thoughts for us before we sign off for the day?
No, I'm actually glad we finished a bit early because I know people need to go and check email and do all that stuff. I have had nothing but a joy. Doing this sort of one way and only having the questions back is very different than being in a room with folks, which I've been blessed to be with a number of people on here. Therefore, I would just again encourage you to be in touch. I'd love to chat. I'd love to talk about any of this which you might find either confounding or interesting, or if you have a particular practice which you're thinking of working on either alone or with others in your organization, or you wanted to put in place something like the Birmingham model, I'm just available to talk about those. So I just hope people will really follow up and take me serious on that, because I'd love to be able to be of service beyond the time together today.
Thank you so much again, John. I want to remind folks at the Community Arts Education Leadership Institute, CALE, we're currently accepting applications, and that application deadline is Friday, April 7th. So if you're interested in working with John further, this is the program in which he is the lead facilitator and really digging into more of these deeper questions and working with an all-star staff. I want to encourage you to apply. If you have questions about CALE, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. We will have a recording of this session posted on the Guild website, and we'll also be sending around those slides for your reference. Again, thank you so much, John and Jessica. This is absolutely fantastic. And of course, thank you all again for joining us today.
Thanks, James. Okay, bye, everybody. Bye, Jessica. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.